In the game Glass Road, players are managing a landscape board. There are three different types of landscape tile, and as this game progresses, players are adding certain tiles and they are removing certain tiles from their landscape board. But players are also adding these buildings onto their landscapes. And this game is actually all about the buildings. At the end of the game, players add up the number of points on their buildings, and that's it. That's the only source of points. And whoever has the most points is the winner. Now, the buildings cost resources. For example, if I wanted to build this swamp hut, it's going to cost me 2 clay. There are actually 8 different types of resources in this game, and you keep a track of them on these 2 production wheels here. So if, for example, I wanted to build the swamp hut, I would simply move my clay marker from 5 down to 3, and then that would enable me to place the building onto my landscape board. How do you get resources? Well, there are 2 ways to get resources. First of all, one way is to get resources by playing cards. Some of the cards have a cost to play them, as you can see on this banner here, but then you will get the resources pictured on the right. Some of the cards give you resources depending on how many of a certain landscape tile that you have on your board. And these cards are also how you get to add landscape tiles onto your board. The pond builder lets you put a pond on your board. The forest manager lets you put an orchard onto your board. These cards are also how you get to put buildings onto your board. This here is the symbol which means that you are allowed to place a building. Whenever you're building a landscape tile, you just take one from the supply, and whenever you're building a building, you choose which building you want from a display. These tiles always have to go on an empty space. However, the landscape tiles, you can always just remove one of those at any time to make space, but the buildings, they cannot be moved or removed. For example, you could play this pond builder and first of all add a pond onto your landscape board and then receive 5 water because you have 5 pond tiles. Or you could receive 5 quartz sand. It's one or the other. You can only choose one type of resource when you do this. But this would actually be a good card for you to play, obviously, because you're clearly fond of ponds. The second way to get resources in a game of Glass Road is by using your buildings. Some of the buildings allow you to consume these landscape tiles for resources, and some of the buildings allow you to process some resources into different resources. These types of buildings are called processing buildings. They have this arrow on them, but there are actually 3 types of buildings. In the top row of the display, you got the processing buildings. The second row, you have these buildings that give you a one-off immediate sort of bounty when you build them. And then the bottom row are the bonus point buildings. You can score lots of points off these buildings, but only if you have a lot of a certain type of landscape tile or a lot of a certain type of resource at the end of the game. Players' landscape boards are all going to look very different, so you want to try and get the right bonus building that's going to score for your particular landscape. So how do you take a turn in a game of Glass Road? Well, each player gets the same deck of 15 cards, and a game of Glass Road is going to consist of 4 rounds of playing these cards. But in a round, you could play as few as 3 cards. So think about that. A game of Glass Road for you could consist of you playing 3 cards 4 times, and that would be like the entire game. But there is actually a way that you can play more cards than that in a round. So let me now show you how a round works. At the start of each round, players have to choose 5 out of their 15 cards. The 10 that they don't select, they are set aside and you're not going to see them until the next round. Then what happens is all players place one of their cards simultaneously. Everybody places one face down on the table, and start player is actually important in this game. Every round, one player is designated to be the start player for the entire round, and they get this goblet. The player with the goblet is the first person to reveal their card and then do the actions on it. And then it goes round the table, players taking it in turn to flip their card over and do their actions. And then those cards are set aside. Everybody puts a card face down again simultaneously. And then starting at the goblet, players take it in turns to flip their card over and do its actions. And then that happens a third time. So in that way, all players will play 3 cards out of their hand, but players have 5 cards, right? Well, here's why turn order matters. If a player reveals a card and you have that card still in your hand, then you are going to get to play that card on the other player's turn. There are these 2 slots at the edge of your landscape board where you can potentially get to play your other 2 cards. Crucially, when you play a card out of turn like this, then you and the player whose turn it is only get to use one of the 2 actions on the card, which is very frustrating for the player whose turn it is. Possibly frustrating for you if you were really counting on doing both of those actions, but the rules say that you cannot refuse. If a card is revealed and you have it in your hand, then you must play it unless you've already played your 2 extra cards. Then, in that case, then you hold on to the card and keep quiet and then just play it as normal on a later turn. So what is going on here? Well, I am trying to get all 5 cards played, but I know that I'm only going to get to choose to play 3 of them, so whenever I select my 5 cards, I'm going to pick 2 that I think that you are going to play. And remember how your board has got all of those pawns on it? Well, for that reason, I'm going to choose the Pawn Builder because I'm expecting you to play that card. So you see, in that way, you need to be careful in Glass Road that your landscape board does not betray what is in your hand. Imagine you reveal your second card and I'm expecting it to be the Pond Builder, but instead you reveal a Cultivator and then build the Swamp Hut. So it turns out you're actually going to consume your pawns for resources. And then perhaps later in the round, I decide, well, I'm going to play the Pawn Builder, at which point you reveal you did have it in your hand because you were hoping that I would do that. So can you see the sort of shenanigans that goes on in this game? There's a lot of double guessing and trying to look at each other's resources and landscape boards and trying to predict what 5 cards players are going to select at the start of each round. I do love this game. It's one of a very small number of games that I owned in 2013 that I still own today. And part of the reason for that is because it's got different rules for the card play for 2 players, but it turns out it's a really fantastic game for 2, as well as 3 and 4. And another reason is there aren't many games like this that pack so much tension into what is quite a short playtime. So for that reason, I have held on to this game for all that time. If I had to use one word to describe this game, it would be dense. It's also physically dense. It packs a ton of components into this box. Actually, we're going to need to take a closer look at these production wheels because the game's about making brick and glass, and I haven't mentioned that yet. But before I do that, I want to say thank you to everyone for liking the videos and subscribing to the channel. It really is amazing, and it's what has motivated me to make this video, which I've really enjoyed doing, so thank you. Let's imagine this is the situation and I receive 1 clay. Now you would expect that I would have 1 food, 1 clay, and 2 charcoal. But no, because there is an empty space now beside that little arrow, which means that that hand is immediately going to move, so that now I actually have 1 fewer of all of the resources, but I have 1 more brick. So in this way, this production wheel produces brick, and the other wheel produces glass. These are the resources that are required to make these refined resources, and that's a really thematic part of the game. But also, you're really going to need glass and brick because a lot of the important and valuable buildings require glass and brick in order for you to build them. But what if I had actually wanted that clay? Well, from this point, if I receive clay again, then the food token will keep that hand in check so that I will actually be able to gather that resource. But yes, managing resources in a game of Glass Road is really rather tricky. Notice that food and charcoal are on both wheels, which thematically makes sense. You need food and charcoal to make glass, and you need those resources to make brick. But if you receive, say, food, let's say you received 3 food, you can't take 2 food on one wheel and then 1 food on another. You have to take the resources all on one wheel when you receive a type of resource. And in the rule book, it actually says that one tip would be to use food to keep one hand on check on one wheel, and then charcoal to keep the other one in check on the other wheel. So that's a useful strategy tip that's in the rule book. Check that out. Another thing to mention is that you start the game with these forest tiles on your landscape board. They can't be removed at will like the landscape tiles. So in order to free up that space, you're going to have to get rid of those forest tiles by either playing particular types of card or by using particular buildings. These forest tiles are never added onto your player board. Sadly, the deforestation of the Bavarian forest was a one-way process. My 2013 edition of the game has got loads of history in the rulebook, which I think is fantastic. Here in 2021, the game is getting a reprint. So after being unavailable and out of print for many years, Capstone Games have now reprinted it so that people can pick up a copy of The Glass Road. I hope they've kept the history in the rulebook. It's a very thematic game, in my opinion. I wonder what a Bavarian glass blower would make of it.
Yeah, no, you ain't no psycho. You're not like the others, no. No changing behaviors. Not sure how to act around you. So colorful and bright, yeah. I wanna be a 9 to 5. You made me come alive, babe. I wanna be the time of your life. Come change my life just for a while. Let's go for a ride now.